Hey everyone, this is Karen from Blue Rooster Farm, and today we are finishing up our quilted leaf table topper. And we're going to be finishing that off by making a scrappy binding and then putting it on the quilt by using the machine binding method. So if you're interested in learning how to do that, stick around. The table topper is now done. You might be using this as a wall hanging or a table topper. I think I'm going to end up using mine as a table topper. We'll see. But I have finished quilting it and I've trimmed the edges off, the extra batting. And it ended up being 32 by 32 when it's all finished. Here is the quilting pattern that I used. It has leaves in it and little swirls, but I thought that was really appropriate for this quilt. So what we need to do now is do the binding. And I was looking at what I had left of the fabric that I thought would go well with this. I use mostly blues and greens from that line. And I didn't have any big pieces enough to make one long strip of binding. I had different colors, um, the different shades of, I had some golds and I had some maroons and I had some oranges, and the other color lines, but I didn't have enough in the blues or the greens. So I decided to take the scraps that I still had left from this topper and make a scrappy binding. And so that's what I'm about ready to do right now. So if you've never made a scrappy binding, it's not hard. It's actually very easy. So let me move this out of the way and I'll show you what I've been doing. So I've been sewing together, piecing together strips. I just went in and took my extra fabric, my leftover fabric from that topper, and just made 2.5-inch strips in the longest length that I could on each scrap piece. So some scrap pieces might be this long. Then you might have some that are quite long, and some that are kind of in between. So they're all different sizes, and it doesn't matter what size they are. I will tell you, when you have smaller size pieces, you're going to have a lot of seams, and so it's going to be a little bit trickier when you're sewing, maybe a little bumpier, but I've not really ever had a problem with it. But some people may find that more difficult to work with because you're going to have that bulky fabric from the seam. And so what you're going to do, and I'm just going to set this aside for a second. This is what I'm working on. Now, you need to figure out how long your binding needs to be. Now, you're going to need to have 128 inches to just go around. That's 4 times 32. But then you're going to need extra for a little bit on the corners and then the overlap. And so I usually like to give myself about at least 12 inches more. I don't know what they recommend, but that's just what I feel safe with. Um, and you can make it longer, and then you'll have some leftover binding. And I've got a whole bunch of leftover binding that I have that I can also use for scrappy binding, as long as they're all the same thickness. Sometimes I'll do 2.25-inch binding, especially on smaller pieces. But if I want to keep them and add them to my binding scrap pieces, I do 2.5. So someday I'm going to have a really scrappy border on some of my quilts. Haven't pulled them out yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 2 of these pieces of fabric, and we don't want to just sew them end to end like this, because when you do that, what you're going to have when this gets folded, it's going to be folded like 3 times when you make a binding, and you're going to have a really big lump right there to sew over. So what we want to do is make sure that we spread that seam out. And we do that by doing an angle. We're gonna sew it in an angle. And so this is the same thing I do when I piece my binding together just regularly. I always do it where I spread that seam out instead of sewing it across. I sew it at an angle and trim off the excess. Um, Also at the end, when I put my binding ends together to finish off the binding, I will use the same method. So what we're going to do is we are going to take both fabrics, right sides together, and we are going to make sure that we line up this edge right here and this edge right here. They should be lined up nicely. Make sure you don't have any selvages or any edges that are rough. They need to be trimmed up just right. Then we're going to take a straight edge, and this is what is actually supposed to be used for this kind of work. It's a 1/4 inch seam line, but I'm just going to use it for the straight line. So here is my corner underneath right here, and I'm just going to put a little line so I can see that right there. I don't know if you can see it or not. And I'm going to take my ruler and go from that corner to this corner over here of this piece, and I'm going to draw a line. Whoops. Get that underneath there nicely. Make sure that shows up. Okay. And now I have a line drawn. Now you can pin this. I am to the point now where I don't even draw the line or pin it, but when you first start, this is probably wise to do. And I put it in the corner so it's not in the way of my presser foot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew directly on that line, going from here to here. And I'll do that real quick. And let's remove our pins. And let's lay it out. And we can see that if we did it correctly, I'll try to give this a finger press here. If we did it correctly, this should be a straight line where that seam is, and this should be a straight line. And those are. I'll give you a closer look. Okay, in the back we have this little triangle that we need to trim off. So we're going to trim 1/4 inch away from that seam line. And since I am doing this with a whole bunch of different fabrics, and there's going to be a lot of seams, I'm going to be pressing all of my seams open like that. So now do you see that when I fold it, so here's my seam right here. When I fold it this way, this is the first fold of a binding, my seam is spread out. It's over here and it's over here. None of it's overlapping. And then when you fold it again, because you're going to fold it once it's attached, it's going to be spread out. It's going to go here. Let me get a pin here. It's going to go from here, up, here, up, and all the way back down. So it's not overlapping in any area. It's going to be a nice and smooth binding. If you had done it where you had the seam straight across, you would have a big bulk right there because you would have 4 seams overlapping. And so that's why we do it this way. So then I need to add this. Normally I just add them as I go, but let me go ahead and stick this one on the one I have here, because I think I might just add one more here in just a second. I think I'm just 1 or 2 short. So if you've got your long piece here, here's the tail, so it keeps going this way. I'm going to lay it across like that. I'm going to lay this one directly on top of it. And again, I'm to the point where I can eyeball it from here to here, just take it over and sew. But until you are sure of yourself, draw that line. And if you have the plate tape where you can draw lines, use that. That's great too. So there's my line right there. Let's put a couple pins so we don't move it. And let's just sew from this corner here to the end over here. Okay, let's see if it turned out okay. Finger press. And that looks good. Okay, trim it 1/4 of an inch away from that seam. And we're going to just remember, press open all of these. I still haven't pressed my other ones yet, but press open these just like that. Okay, so I think I'm going to add one more, and then this is going to be ready to be ironed, and I'll show you how to put it on. I have this binding all pressed. I pressed all the seams open, and then I just pressed it in half lengthwise like this so that everything is nice and neat. So if you're not able to get to your binding after this point and you need to stop, you don't want to leave your binding in a pile like this, because it'll just get all wrinkled up after you've pressed it nicely. So what I always do is I will wind it on something. Now, you can find things in your sewing room that might work, like this is an old spool. You could just take it, find the end here, and just wrap it around this spool once you get it started, and it will keep just fine for you. Here's another spool. This was probably on some kind of machinery. It's a spool for some kind of thread. Or they make special binder keepers. And these two I got, I believe both of them came in a Fat Quarter Sew Sampler box. This is Lori Holt's, and hers is really cute. It's got, I don't know if you can see that, it's got a bee engraved on it, and some, or a beehive engraved on it, and there's a little bee over here zipping around. And so this is a nice sturdy piece of plastic, and you can use this. So you would just take your tail here. Let's find that tail again. There it is. And you would just wrap it right here, and you would keep your binding nice and neat like that. Just keep going till it's all gone. And then this one was, I believe, Riley Blake. Yes, this is a Riley Blake quilty tool. And this one is in the shape of a, I believe that's a churn dash. And you can, this one has actually a little slot right there that you can start your binding in. And it's kind of nice because it's just kind of the right width, and you just flip it around like that. So this is probably a good size for this one, since it's not going to be that long. I'm just going to wind this up because I am not going to be able to get this on the quilt right now. I'm going to bring you back after a while or tomorrow, and we're going to get it on the quilt. But this will keep my binding all nice and neat. Like I say, you don't have to buy any kind of special tool. You can find something around your sewing room or your house. Another thing, you can just kind of wind it around a piece of cardboard, and that would be fine too. These are just really cute. A lot of times people will make their binding before they're finished with their quilt, and this is nice to keep it handy and neat so that it'll just be packaged away with all the quilt fabric that you're using to make your quilt. So we've just about got that wound up. And then you can put a little pin or a clip there, or you could tuck it in. I'll just tuck it in. So there we have our binding, and I will bring you back when we start putting this binding on our topper. It is the next day, and we are going to get this binding on. First of all, I don't know if we talked about, I had gone ahead and quilted mine on the long arm. And as you can see, I did a leaf type pattern on there. If you wanted to, if you don't have a long arm, or if you didn't want to send it off to somebody to do, you can just do free motion on your machine. If you know how to do pantographs on your machine, that would be great. Or you could trace lines and follow them. Also doing in the ditch or straight line quilting. Now I do have that leaf that we did for a sample. I went ahead and turned it into a little pad. I put batting in it. I added a narrow border along all the edges, and then I did a crisscross pattern. I just drew one line, and then I had a walking foot, and I have a bar on it that you can just put into the stitch right next to it, so you only have to draw one line and you just keep going. And then you do the other direction and you keep going. So I just did like a cross hatch on the diagonal. You could do just straight lines. That would be fine. Whatever you want. The quilting is basically to keep the top down onto your backing, and it just gives it good stability. So I just bound this edge then with the same as I used for the backing, and I can just put this on a table, or I can use it in the kitchen as a something to set hot food on. It's not insulated with Insulbrite or anything. It's just batting, but you know, don't throw away your blocks. You can always make cute things with them. So when you're quilting your topper, you've got lots of different options. And if you Google how to free motion with your sewing machine, there's lots of videos out there that will show you how to do that. All right, so now what we need to do is we need to get this binding on. Now there are two ways of putting on binding that I use. One of them is I sew the binding onto the top with the sewing machine, and then I flip it over, and then I'll hand sew it down on the back. And that is the traditional way of doing binding, and it looks very nice because your stitches in the back are hidden. You don't see those stitches. So that's a really nice traditional way of doing it. The only problem with that, it takes more time. You've got to find some time to sit and stitch. And the hand sewing takes a lot more time than your sewing machine. So today and nowadays, I am mostly using the sewing machine to do all of my binding. I will stitch it on one side, flip it over, and then stitch it with the sewing machine to secure it completely. If I'm making a special gift for someone, I will probably go ahead and do a hand sewn binding, or if it's something that I worked really hard on and I think it might be like an heirloom style quilt, I would do a hand sewn binding just to keep it the very best and traditional. But most of my quilts and my toppers I use every day, and that's what I make them for. They're not to showcase, they're just to use. And so any way that I can get the binding on the quickest, we can use it more quickly. So I'm not a perfectionist when it comes to sewing. Things usually end up looking very nice. You know, people don't stop and go into detail and looking at all your stitches when they're looking at a quilt or just using a quilt. Unless you point something out, they're not going to notice. So saying that, we're going to put this binding on with the machine, and I'll show you how I do it. Now, I did put thread in my machine that matched the very best with my background and my binding and my backing. I tried blues, I tried greens, I tried grays, just laid them across to see. And really, I decided to go with this color. It matches the background, but it also matches the backing. And that's where I will be seeing more of the stitches going off a little bit. It will blend in pretty good with the colors, but it was the one that I felt was the most usable. But you always want to look at your binding and decide what will blend in the best, because the better you blend your thread, the less likely you can see the mistakes. When you machine stitch a binding on, you always apply the binding to the back first. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to turn it over and we're going to put our binding first on the back. And I'm going to leave about a 12-inch tail, and I'm not going to leave this seam on that tail. I think I'm going to go start right about here. And I want that tail to be pretty much centered on that side, so that when we go to match those ends up, it'll be easier to work with. So we're going to go over here, and I'm going to let out a little binding, and I just sew this on. If you need to pin it or you need to clip it, go right ahead. I don't need to. I like to just eyeball it. Now, I do have my machine set for 1/4 inch away from the edge of the presser foot. I also have this neat little seam holder, or I'm not sure what they call them, but it goes right next to my presser foot, and it's a very strong magnet. So when my presser foot is down, it is right next to it, and I make it extend out a little bit, and that way I just keep my quilt and my binding pressed right up against that edge, and that makes me know that my seam allowance is exactly 1/4 inch. All right, so my first couple stitches I'm just going to do, and then I'm going to back stitch. Okay. And when you're doing this, just make sure you're not getting any drag from your quilt, because that will affect your stitch and your stitch length. So I'm just going to kind of hold it up a little bit. Now, when you get to 1/4 inch away from this edge right here, when you get to here, what you're going to do, you're sewing along, you are going to stop and pivot and go off the corner. So we're going to do that. I'm just going to kind of keep my eye on where that corner is. And there I'm about 1/4 inch away. I'm going to stop. I'm going to pivot. And I'm going to go off the edge. Now I'm going to lift my presser foot up, but I'm not going to cut my thread. So let's take a look. We are going to give us a little bit of room here. We are going to take our binding, and we are now going to go straight up, just like that. Let's see if you can see that all right. We want to make sure that it is going straight right here. This is all going straight. Then when you go over here, this should be going at a perpendicular line to your top edge, and it is. Then we're going to bring it back down, and we're going to make sure that that fold is right at that edge. Okay. If you want good corners, this is what you need to do. When you go to turn this in and you're trying to get a nice corner, it all depends on what you're doing right here. Okay, so now we're going to go right up to that again, put our presser foot down, make sure our threads aren't in the way. And we're going to stitch. And I'm going to speed this up right here. Okay, we're coming to the corner again. Again, here is my edge. Okay, here is my edge. I need to go a little farther. Okay. So here is the corner right here. I'm going to continue sewing. When I get 1/4 of an inch away from this edge here, I'm going to stop, pivot, and go off the corner, just like that. I'm going to move this just a little bit. Okay. Lift up our presser foot, give us some thread, back up just a little bit. Okay, we're going to take it and go, oops, let's see if I can give it a little more. Okay. All right, we're going to take it so it goes straight up. This over here is also perpendicular with this line right here, and we are going to crease it right there. Then we are going to bring it straight down, making sure our corner or our edge is right at that fold, and we are going to follow the edge of our quilt. So let's bring that back right over here. Get my presser foot put back over here, and let me turn this. Okay, and we're ready to sew again. Okay, we're back at the next corner. Here's my corner. Going to continue on down my 1/4 of an inch. When I get 1/4 of an inch away, I'm going to stop, pivot, and go off at the angle. Pick up your presser foot, give yourself some thread. Make sure it's going straight up. Fold it down. Let's just see what it looks like. And you can try to keep that from sticking out there. Like that. Put it back under your presser foot. And we're ready to go. And I'm just going to go just a few more inches. Then I'm going to do a couple back stitches just to secure it, and let's pull it off. Okay, here's what we have. Here's our tail from where we started, and here is the binding that we have made. So I like to usually treat them pretty equally and kind of do it somewhere in the middle. So we've got stitches from here to here. So right in here, I'm going to be trimming it. Now I notice one of my seams is right here. I don't want to have that involved. So I think what I'll do, I think I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to trim up here. That way I can stay away from this seam and we won't have too much bulk anywhere. I could trim it here, but it doesn't leave me very much space here. If I go farther up here, I still have that much space. I think I'm going to trim it right there. It is going to be at a diagonal that we sew it on, so that's what I'm kind of looking at here. But I think our diagonal will be going parallel. So we'll just do this together. We'll learn it together. So what I want to do is usually I'll take a little piece of my tail of my binding, and I'll just cut it straight like this, and I'll open it up. Now this is the width that I want those fabrics to overlap. So we're going to lay this here, and I'm going to put this, so we're going to have the overlap right in here. Okay. So that means I need to cut this top fabric here and this bottom piece of binding here. That way we'll have this much overlap of the two. So let me first trim this one off. Okay, get rid of that one. Okay, now I'll show you what we have. I'll just move this for a second. So now we have this long tail here, and then we've trimmed this one down, okay? So what I could do is I could lay this shorter one underneath and this longer one on top. And you want to make sure that you've got a nice flat quilt so you don't have any buckles. And then I'm going to kind of stretch this binding just a little bit, because I find that I have a tendency to make my binding longer than my quilt. So I always like to cut it just a hair short. So here is the piece that I'm overlapping there. And let's see if I can get you closer. Okay, here's the piece that I'm using for my overlap. I'll turn it that way. Maybe you can see it easier. I need to make sure that it is lined up with the binding that's on the bottom. So let me put it right there. And so I'm going to need to cut my top binding right here. I am going to cut it just a little bit shorter. So this is it. A little bit shorter, just because I have found that I have a tendency to make my binding a little bit wider. So here's the line right here. I'm just going to go in just a hair inside of it. So right there I've made a snip. You can see, I don't know if it's 1/8 of an inch or what. So I'm going to trim it right there. So now what we have is an overlap that measures just a little bit less than that width of the width of our binding. Remember, our binding is 2.5 inches. This is the width of it, okay? So now I've got that. Get rid of that. So now we need to make sure that we get this so it's not twisted. And here's what I do. I take my fingers, and on this top binding, and I'm going to move you back a little bit again. On this top binding, I put my finger in the middle of it, if I can get it. Okay, like that. I'm going to pick it up like this. Do the same with the other one. So I'm picking them both up like this, and I'm going to lay this one like this, and I'm going to do this one like this. And it looks, if you can use your imagination, it looks kind of like the letter A. You might need to fold your quilt a little at this point. So the capital letter A, and here's where it's going up, it's coming down. That's the capital letter A. Now what we need to do is we need to make the line of the A that goes across. So we need to go from this corner across to this corner. So here's your A. We need to make it go across. So we're going to match edges all up, and we're going to put pins in it. And it's a little easier having it laid on the thing, but I want to hold it up so you can see it. And then we're going to make sure that's still attached there. Put one on this corner down here. We're just trying to keep it out of our presser foot's way. And if you want to, you can draw a line from here to here. And I'll do that for you. Usually I just eyeball it when I go to the sewing machine. I just lay it down and I just sew from here to here, but we'll do a line. And you gotta make sure you know where that corner is. It's right there. So let's put it there, and let's put it there. Oh, let's see here. Let me get one of my pins. Okay. And again, this is just going to be a stitch line. It's okay if it doesn't come out. This is a friction pin though. It will erase with heat. Okay. So I hope you can see that. Let's see. Right there, we're going to sew from there to there. You just have to keep it together. And I'm going to move my seam holder. And I'm going to back you up just a little bit. And we're going to manipulate this so that we can get a nice flat sewing area. Okay, so now I need to switch my needle to the middle position because I just want to go straight down the middle. My string wants to, or my thread wants to get caught around my presser foot today. Okay. So there's what I've stitched right there. I can take my pins out. Now before I cut, we're going to check and see if we got this right. So we're just going to let it fall back into shape there. And yes, it's going all the right direction. So we can now take that half square out of there and just trim it 1/4 of an inch away from that seam that we just sewed. So let's just do that. And I'm just going to finger press this. I want to finger press it open because we don't want the bulky seams. Now, as you can see, we came really close to that line where we had our scrappy binding. So when you're using scrappy binding, give yourself plenty, get back here a little farther, give yourself a big opening so that you have plenty of room to maneuver if you have lots of seams. And we had enough room. If we needed to, we could have taken some stitches out and that would have been fine too, just to make it bigger. So now we've got both of those nicely pressed open. We're going to close it up. At this point, I usually put a pin in it, and I do not see it gapping. If it were gapping, if this were gapping, some people will go ahead and put this presser or the feed dog side down so that it could take up the gathering. Usually the quilt has enough stretch that you can stretch it while you're sewing, and that will help. This one shouldn't be a problem. So let me go ahead and close this opening up, and get that binding sewn on the rest of the way. Now I'm going to start about 1 inch or 2 behind where I did my back stitch, and I will just do a back stitch here. Oh, and I need to set my presser or my needle back to 1/4 of an inch from the edge. I can go ahead and put this down. You got to remember to keeping those needle spots in the right position. Sometimes I kick myself when I start sewing because I move my needle and then I've got a bigger seam allowance for my blocks, and I have to go in and rip them out, rip the seams out. Okay, here we go. Couple stitches, back stitch a couple times, and then sew. And again, I have this plastic topper that my husband cut for me, and then I also have a cutting mat, and so it kind of grabs my quilts as I sew, and so that makes it a little tricky. I probably should just scoot this back a little bit, but I just kind of stop and pull it up, stop and pull it up. If you have a sewing machine that's in a cabinet, you would not have this problem. And if you don't have a table like this that's level with your sewing machine, they are really nice. They are expensive. That's why I just went and bought a piece of plexiglass. And my husband cut it out for me. He figured out the shape of my sewing machine bed, cut it out, sanded it, routed it a little bit, and he made a real big one for me, so I have lots of room. It's not as perfect as the ones that you buy, but it works really, really good. And I'm almost there. And you can see that little bubble up right there. Let me get you a little closer. I don't know if you can see it. There's just a little slight bubble of the fabric right there. If I pull right here and kind of hold that, it goes away. So I don't have any little pleats. And then I go a couple of stitches onto that stitching that we did earlier, and then back stitch. And we have our binding attached. Okay, I have pressed all of the binding flat on the back like this. So in the front, we now have this. Now at this point, some people like to go ahead and take their Wonder Clips and go ahead and clip down their binding like this. And just go all the way around their quilt. I'm not going to clip, but you can definitely clip if you want. Those Wonder Clips tend to snag on my counter here, so we're just going to do it like this. Now you can start anywhere you want to start sewing your binding down in the front, and you may want to go around and just see that, you know, the fabric starts losing some threads, but you can always trim those off afterwards too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it in, and I'm going to go right up to that seam, and I'm going to just overlap it a little bit. So here's my seam. It's doing a really good job of hiding it, and going right there. So see, I'm not too concerned about it being perfect because that thread is hard to see already. So I'm going to go down and I'm going to stitch right along this edge right here. Okay, back you up a little bit. And sometimes I need to adjust my needle. Gonna do a couple back stitches. And I'm going to turn down my speed a little bit. I've got a lead foot, so need to slow it down. Okay, we're getting close to our corner. I'm just going to get a little closer. Now what I'm going to do, and I'm going to move this just out of the way a little bit here, is I am going to take my stiletto, and I'm going to keep that seam going straight out like this and just pull on it so it's nice and flat. And then I'm going to lay my stiletto right there, and I'm going to fold this up, and you can see it meets very nicely right here. So I'm going to push my stiletto right there and hold it like a pin. And get one stitch on that. Very good. Then we're going to keep our needle down and pivot our quilt. Put that back in place. And so far you can see back up again. About there is probably good. Okay, and I just use the stiletto to keep the edge of the fabric right near that seam, just barely overlapping that seam. And sometimes when you've got that heel back there, it can get you stuck a little bit. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just give it a push with my stiletto. There we go. And once you're over that bump, it should go fine. And then when you get to that point, pick it up. And the sharp stilettos are nice because they can work as a pin too. And you can hear I'm going through lots of layers. There's lots of seams on this quilt right here. And then there's also seams on the binding. So you've got lots of bumpy layers. So just take your time. Coming to our corner again. Move that out of the way. Sometimes you just have to kind of pull a little bit. Okay, that's where they're meeting, right there. Gotta poked it right there like a pin. And I'm going to get right up and take a bite of it. There we go. We're gonna tilt the quilt. Put the seam guide back in. That's what that thing is called, the seam guide. I knew the name of that. Okay. And away we go. here's where I started, right down here. So I just want to make sure I don't have any gaps or anything or too much fabric anywhere, and it looks like I'm good. And then you want to make sure you overlap it just a little bit and then do a stitch backwards. When I said overlap, overlap your starting stitches. All right, let's take this off and see what it looks like. Get all of our threads. Okay. So there's what it looks like on the top. And then on the back, if you were perfect, it would be in the ditch the whole time, but of course, that is not easy to do. So every once in a while I get just a little bit out of it right there, but you're not even going to notice it. Another corner. Now, one thing as I was sewing, I was thinking about, okay, so you have those flying geese and you do have points. Now, if you have a hard time with your points, when you trim your quilt down after you've quilted it, leave yourself extra batting and go just a little bit deeper. So like this one right here, let's see, this one right here, cut it off a little bit. And if I were watching, I could have gone inside of it just a little bit, but it doesn't matter to me. I didn't care. This one right here, I got quite a bit of it. I was watching more of the corner coming to the corner. It doesn't matter. It will look beautiful whether you have your points or not. So let me lay this out and let's take a look at it. There is our finished table topper. And we can go a little closer. And the binding works really good because since it's kind of a scrappy border, the scrappy binding works really, really well with it. And then of course, our quilting on there matched perfect. So there you have our quilted leaf table topper. And again, it's just a little over 32 by 32 now that the binding's on it, and it's a great size. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on how to make a scrappy binding and how to put your binding on using the machine. If you're enjoying the content that I produce on my channel, please consider subscribing. I would really appreciate that. Also, liking and sharing is very helpful to my channel. Again, if you have questions, please leave them in the comments and I'd be glad to get back with you. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.